I want to begin today with a story from Saint Antony of the Desert. And it goes something like this. A pilgrim, a seeker, a wanderer, someone longing for a deeper, richer spiritual life, comes to see Saint Antony, and why not? Don't we all need help? Aren't we all seeking a teacher, a mentor, someone to point in the right enough direction? And this kind of dynamic was going on between the desert fathers and mothers, as they're called, and the town, civilization, culture. And Antony was a 4th century monk. And what's important about that is that this was a time period of great upheaval, like wild upheaval in the Roman Empire. And this movement, which we would now call Christianity, which had been up to that point kind of an underground movement, what the Romans would have considered a cult, an illegal religion, had spread around the Roman Empire and beyond, and in very simple ways, gathering around tables and in homes and celebrating the sacred meal together and baptizing and following the intuition and genius of Paul's insight that in Christ there's no Jew or Gentile, male or female, slave or free, which is a fundamentally dangerous and radical statement in light of civilization and culture with its polarities and hierarchies and social status and layers and who's in and who's out and who's worthy and who's unworthy and who's rich and who's poor. And this movement had swept around the world, but in the 4th century it was shifting, it was changing, and the religion, the religion of the Roman Empire the religions of the Roman Empire were collapsing or unraveling and losing their potency. And you probably know the story, but Constantine has a kind of conversion experience and makes Christianity legal. And then in the years that follow, not only is Christianity a legal religion, but then becomes the religion of the Roman Empire with all of the dangers and opportunities in tow of when politics and religion get into bed together. And right away, what's so profound about the desert fathers and mothers is that, here's a line from Merton, they saw society as a shipwreck. Like there was something that the essence of Christianity, you could say, or of following Jesus or the Christ mystery that was being dashed upon the rocks of society and civilization. And Merton says, and they swam for their lives. Society was a shipwreck, and they swam for their lives, and they swam to the desert. And they poured themselves out, and they emptied themselves, and they sat in caves, and they sang songs, and they studied, and they wrote psalms upon the cave walls, which I've seen in Egypt. And they wrestled with demons, the afternoon demon they called it, and the inner life, the beginning of a real deep exploration of the inner life and what's in there. And kind of in an amazing, strange way, institutional Christianity continued on, but it's like the desert fathers and mothers kept alive the essence, the underground stream, the mystical stream, the contemplative stream, the heartbeat, the soul, you could even say, beneath the persona or the mask of, a religious and political establishment. And I'm not even really saying right now, personally, that one is better than the other. And I mean, I guess I have a bias, but maybe a better way of saying it is, and I'm not saying that this move of politics and religion and institutionalization is inherently wrong or evil or something. Sometimes it just goes this way, and perhaps all religion, particularly Christianity, has to go through these cycles of where it falls in love with its own the power systems and codes and loses the way. And then there are those who flee to the desert and swim for their lives. And we're in that age. That's what I'd like to argue. We're there again. Here we are again. And where are the voices of wisdom? Where are the elders? Where are the teachers? Where's the desert? Where's the landscape that can allow us to get quiet again, to hear the still small voice? Where's the place of real self-examination where we take the plank out of our own eye and we wrestle with our own demons? Where is this land? Or are we just going to stay trapped in our phones and in our tiny world? And this brings me back to the story. And a pilgrim comes to Antony and says, how do I start? Where do I begin? And Saint Antony says something very simple. He says, know thyself. Okay, where should I begin? Know thyself. And in that kind of almost Zen-like koan fashion, he doesn't really explain himself. But, how would you feel if you walked all the way out to the desert 3 days and 3 nights and stood in the mouth of a cave and said, how do I start? How do I start a deeper journey? And a voice from the cave says, know thyself. What would you walk away with? I mean, my feeling right now is, first of all, I'd have to wonder, do I not know myself? Which is the very thing I wondered when I first heard this line. I was actually in graduate school at Hebrew U, and we were studying the early Christianity, and I don't know, just among the many texts we had to read, it just kind of ran me through. It's like, oh, wait, maybe I don't know myself all that well. And although I thought I did, I knew my Enneagram number, I knew my Myers-Briggs. I have my own tastes and proclivities, which I'm in love with, my way of doing things, my way of seeing things. As a 4, I fill in the blank, or with my 5 wing, I'm not picking on the Enneagram, but maybe I'm a little bit picking on the most immature way in which it's used often. And same with all of these, I don't know, models and maps of human personality that give us a sense of identity. It's like, well, maybe we don't know, because what I hear from Antony is a little more mysterious. Well, what does that really mean? And the funny thing is, that phrase, know thyself, if I just said that in our spiritualish culture, that wouldn't be rejected. People say, well, that's what I'm busy doing, getting to know myself. I'm getting to know my true self. I'm following my own authenticity. I'm shedding all these cultural layers, and this is who I am, and this is how I identify. And we're almost in love with knowing ourselves. So yeah, that's interesting. Is that what Saint Antony means? I heard a spiritual teacher say once, she said, I'll never betray that inner voice. And part of me trusted a kind of courage I heard in what she was saying. But the next thing that came into my mind was, which one? Which voice? If you're like me, there's something like a legion in there, a village of competing. It's like a family argument at the Thanksgiving table. Those are the voices in my head. So which one? Which inner voice? What are we talking about? The true self, to use a Merton phrase? So yeah, I'm just stirring up some possibilities. What does it mean to know thyself? And is there a kind of contemporary way of hearing that has led us astray? That's what I'm wondering. Which brings me to the title of this podcast. Okay, so a couple weeks ago, my wife was reading something or listening to something, I can't remember which, and she said, hey, have you ever heard this line from C.S. Lewis that hell is endless autobiography? I was like, no. I almost felt a little flush of embarrassment because, yeah, I've spent a lot of my time turning over my own story. I found the larger quote here. It's in the introduction to Paradise Lost, to a translation of Paradise Lost. And here's what C.S. Lewis says. He says, to admire Satan, which is a funny thing to begin with, to admire Satan, the accuser, then is to give one's vote not only for a world of misery, that seems obvious, a world of misery, but also for a world of lies and propaganda and wishful thinking. Lies and propaganda and wishful thinking. Whoa, yeah. Talk about summarizing the news feed and a lot of what pours out of our phone: misery, lies, propaganda, and wishful thinking. And he ends by saying, of incessant autobiography. To admire Satan is to involve ourselves in incessant autobiography. In other words, hell is endless autobiography. It's not that autobiography is wrong. You got to start somewhere. I remember back in the day at Mars Hill, we had this class where I don't remember what it was called, but it was essentially like learning to tell your story and in a way to rewrite your story. And that's a lot of even what we might call therapy and counseling and getting to know your own story. What happened to me? What is happening to me? What are the patterns that I'm carrying? And it's therapeutic in the sense of, as that narrow sense of story expands in conversation and dialogical conversation in the therapy chair or even with a trusted friend or in a larger community, it's like, okay, it fills out a bit and it's rewritten slightly. And we say, yes, what a thing to celebrate. And in a way, that is a step toward knowing thyself. After all, much of what happens to us gets pushed down into the unconscious, and many of our patterns, we like to keep them in the dark. And so really, really important first steps. But at a certain point, is the point to just turn our story, our personality, our way of seeing things, our wants, our desires, our proclivities, our tastes over and over again? That's, I think, what Ken Wilber means by the cul-de-sac of nihilism and narcissism. Round and round and round and round we go. In other words, hell is endless autobiography. We need enough, but then also we got to let it go. It's like any decent model of human development, like the one we use at Animus, the nature-based model, which is in Nature and the Human Soul, this 8-stage model, which I'm not going to go into right now, has as a fundamental expression growth, shedding, changing, expanding, letting go, things dying, new things being reborn. In other words, just like the natural world. The natural world is the template for this model. And the point is not to get to a place and then go round and round and round and round and round and round. Yet that's what we're likely to do. And we're likely to get stuck right now in celebrating the narrowness of our own perspective. That's what the image of narcissist, the original Greek image, was in part helped illuminate. Like, oh yeah, we get to the edge of the pond, we stare into the pond, and we fall in love with ourselves. We fall in love with a reflection of ourselves. It's not even the real thing. A tiny pebble in the stone can shake this image we have of ourselves and shatter it, at least for a few minutes. And it's not even that real. It's just an image. And yet we fall in love with it, and we promote it, and we post about it, and we brag about it, and we shape it, and we name it and claim it, and we manifest it, and whatever. I'm guilty. I am guilty of getting stuck in this cul-de-sac of endless autobiography. So what does it mean to really know ourselves? How would we come to know ourselves? And that's not so easy to answer. I mean, it's sort of like saying, how do we grow up psychologically and spiritually? Well, it's complex. There are many tributaries here, and as many distractions and detours and false steps and suburbs and cul-de-sacs to get stuck in. And this leads me to another kind of image from C.S. Lewis, one of the books that struck me, I think I first read it in college. I went through this whole C.S. Lewis phase in college. It was when I first started recognizing, wait, I don't really know much about my own faith. I've rejected or accepted the ideas and beliefs handed to me by my parents and youth group leaders and so forth, but I haven't done really any kind of investigation on my own. That's age appropriate, that's like early adolescent awakening, like, whoa, what's authentically mine? And I started with C.S. Lewis and like, well, what's he have to say? And he's interesting because on the one hand, he's very easy to read. On the other hand, the ideas are quite rich and profound. And as I'm saying it now, I think even his kind of creative and mythic mode of consciousness, I resonated with and maybe didn't even know why, and was a kind of maybe doorway to a future I would one day discover. Like, I love myths and stories and the imaginal realm, and anyway, I just, C.S. Lewis was like a gateway drug for me. And anyway, he's got a book called The Great Divorce, and it's about hell. It's an allegory about hell. And, I know, like, in progressive Christianity circles, like, we want nothing to do with hell. It's the first thing to go. Hell doesn't exist. And so it's like, to contemplate its possibility it makes us uncomfortable, and with the deepest concepts, God, soul, hell, the self, we have to go the way of story, parable, poem, prose, image, allegory, just to get close to a sense of what's being described. And so hell in the Great Divorce is kind of a dull and dreary gray town, which is funny. It's kind of like England itself. But more importantly, its qualities, the qualities are an increased sense of isolation and discontent. In fact, those who are in hell, in the suburbs here, in this little dull and dreary town of isolation, are filled with complaints. And what they do all day long is complain and share their grievances about life and the unfairness of life, and what they didn't get or what's owed them, or so forth and so on. And in fact, people in hell here get into fights and move further away from town, which I think is amazing. Like, and their house grows. If I remember correctly, it's like you can build a bigger house further from town, and be further from annoying people, and those who don't get it and who aren't right, like you are, and you can build a bigger house and protect your stuff even more, your possessions and your place. And that's the image of hell. And it's funny because a bus comes around once a day or so, and you can get on the bus and go to heaven. It's like not that far. It's the same. The distance between heaven and hell is the width of a blade of grass. That's somewhere in that book. And every once in a while the bus comes by and you can just hop on, but it's like, I don't want to go back to people. I don't want to go back to connection. I don't want to leave my world of isolation. In other words, hell is endless autobiography, and you're crafting your own home, and the rooms are all to your taste, and you've got your degrees up on the wall, and you've got your library to protect you, and you've got your ideas, and you've got your flags, and you've got your artwork. You have the furniture arranged the way you want it. You get to watch what you want to watch on television, and whatever. If they have TVs in hell, imagine they probably do. And but you're stuck. You're stuck inside your own story and with all your grievances, and there's no place for change and transformation, because there'd have to be a shedding to change form. You'd have to say, well, this house isn't working for me anymore, and I have to venture out into the unknown and out beyond the horizon of my own ego. And so this raises certain questions for me. Like, here's a really simple one. Well, how would we avoid the cul-de-sac of hell? And that's not so easy to answer. How do we maintain a right enough balance between knowing thyself and then falling in love with some version of ourselves or a persona or our own ego? Or if I can use the very simple, I'm sort of conflating a bit Richard Rohr and Ken Wilber. Maybe Rohr got it from Wilber, but the cosmic egg of consciousness is a line from Rohr. And anyway, it looks something like this: from egocentric, like the I is the center of reality, and it grows to a we, to ethnocentric, oh, my group, my family. Wow, great, massive move, huge. And then what's beyond the ethnocentric? Well, the cosmos-centric mode of consciousness, which includes the I and the we, but also the totality, the cosmos, the largest possible, or to use an indigenous phrase, all my relations, the human and the non-human, the soul and the spirit, the totality. But we're just likely, if we're honest, to get stuck in egocentric consciousness. And maybe a little bit of my group, my identity, my life, my flag, my country, so forth, the we. And to a certain extent, that's growth beyond the I, okay, but it's also limited. How do we keep moving, keep growing, keep consenting to being shaped and challenged and changed, and as if the only way to grow is a series of ongoing deaths and renewals and starting again? Maybe we have to go out to Antony once a year and say, where do I begin? And he says, know thyself. You thought you knew, and now you don't. Okay, so I'd like to try to describe a few things here that I found helpful. And some of what I'm going to do is popularize, well, I don't know how popular it's going to be, but I'm going to, what's another way of saying it, summarize a book that I read this summer called Journey Into Emptiness. Let me quick find the author. One sec. Okay, the author is Robert Gunn. I'm not sure how to say his last name, Gunn. It's a book about three people. It's a book about change, transformation, and growth, but it's a book about three people. Dogen, medieval monk, Buddhist, Thomas Merton, and Carl Jung. You can see why I liked the book. Journey Into Emptiness. And it's really about the experience of emptiness in Dogen and in Merton and in Jung, and how, in a way, it was both terrible and also an opening to a deep spiritual life, a deep spiritual practice, a deep spiritual awakening, and a deep contribution to the nature of spiritual growth itself, of continuing on the journey, of not getting stuck in the cul-de-sac and moving out beyond the edge. And in fact, this author uses the phrase of something like journey to the edges. He says a spiritual life, the kind of spiritual life that's described here in the book and in the lives of these three people is a journey to the edge. And that's scary. That's difficult. That's challenging. It's provocative. But before I get to sort of what he calls the four foundations of a spiritual life, I want to talk about, in the broadest possible terms, how a spiritual life or a religious life, I prefer religious life, as you've heard me probably say on this podcast before, and I take religious life to be a kind of orientation toward ultimate meaning. It's a way of taking seriously the religious instinct and orienting our life in a certain direction towards ultimate meaning. That's a religious life, or we could say a spiritual life too. But sort of a claim I want to make is that religions and spirituality, spiritual practices, at their best, have always helped us not get stuck in the cul-de-sac of me, my story, my ideas, my way of life, so forth. It's both the spiritual life both holds us somewhere recognizable and communal, but also confronts us. I know a lot of sort of progressive Christian circles. There's not a lot of talk about repentance. There's not a lot of talk about condemnation, and it's like we would rather avoid that. And I understand why. Like, Christianity has gone too far the other way in certain circles, where it's all about condemnation and turn or burn, and you're not worthy and you're totally depraved, and it tends to exaggerate, but in its capacity to confront and to challenge. But it seems like at least in progressive circles, we've gone too far the other way, and it's like no. There's a time and a place where a healthy spiritual life does confront and challenge and shakes us free and from too much self-absorption. In other words, from hell itself, and normalizes it. In the rhythms and patterns and seasons and ceremonies and stories and religious life itself, it helps us pass through. It helps us come to the limits of ourself, of who we think we are, and step one more step toward the unknown. As maybe that haunting line from David White, who says we're the only species privileged enough to refuse its own flowering. Like, it's a kind of privilege to be gifted with will and autonomy, and with it comes the possibility that we might create a mansion unto ourselves in a dreary village far away from connection to anything real. In other words, hell. We can refuse our own flower. We can refuse the way in which we might grow. We can refuse growth itself. Maybe you've been to a funeral or two, and maybe you wouldn't use this language, but somewhere in your heart you knew, this person got stuck. They refused their own flowering. They clung too tightly to some adolescent image they had of themselves. And yeah, it's a tragedy. There's a kind of sadness, and no wonder. It's a common refrain that the desert fathers and mothers will flee society and all of its values and find themselves again in relationship to God and the world. And those of us stuck in civilization will wander out and say, hey, help us here. Help us. We feel stuck. Help us. Okay, so I want to describe, this is in the very end of the book, Journey Into Emptiness, and it's almost an aside. And he does something quite bold, which is say, I want to give you 4 foundations of a spiritual life. And I love this. Like, it reminds me of Ronald Rolheiser's book. I'll probably mention that maybe at the end here. He says there are 4 non-negotiables to a Christian spiritual life. That's a bold claim, especially these days. Like, whoa, slow down, bro. You're telling me that there are non-negotiables? Like, there's a foundation to the spiritual life? I thought the spiritual life is whatever I want it to be. And so kind of pretty bold. And but he's not just pulling this, out of nowhere, but having looked at the lives of these really influential people. Well, what are the foundations here? How do we leave behind the known for the unknown? And of course, I want to say, now I'm backing off, I'm not here to tell you what's right for you on your spiritual life. I can just say, here are the patterns. Here's what works for me. Here's my experience. And if we listen to the voices of wisdom, like, what are they telling us? And, but also I honor the wild individuality of your own journey, and only you can deepen into what's calling to you. But at the very least, I'd like to point to some patterns. And, okay. Maybe I should just give them to you right off the bat here, and then I'll try to unpack them. He says the 4 foundations of a spiritual life, and I'll just add maybe a healthy spiritual life. We need a container. We need a teacher. We need a practice, and we need community. Let me put it in terms of the cul-de-sac. How do we avoid the cul-de-sac of nihilism, narcissism? How do we avoid hell? How do we avoid endless autobiography? We need a container. We need a teacher, or 2 maybe, or 3. We need a practice. Well, what kind of practice? Well, maybe I'll come to that. And we need a community. Wait a minute. I thought I could go it alone, craft a religion on my own. And what the great spiritual traditions, what's interesting about this is there's Jungian depth psychology. He's sort of saying this is a tradition into itself. There's Christian mystical contemplative Christianity, that's Merton, and there's the Zen tradition. So he's really quite broad in bringing these 3 streams together, but he's saying they all seem to echo these 4 dimensions, 4 foundations of a spiritual life. Do I have a container? Do I really have a teacher? Have I really said yes to a practice? And do I have an actual community? Okay, so let's maybe dive a little deeper into some of these things. And okay, let's start with container. So what he means, I think, by container is a holding environment. That's a phrase from Winnicott, a holding environment. An actual physical place with some boundaries. And boundaries are important because it provides protection from too much chaos, too much input, too much flooding. This far you shall come, but no further. It's like there's a strange paradox that it's within limits that we find freedom. And I'm not saying, I was about to say a good example of that is marriage, and well, it depends on what kind of marriage you're in, of course. But marriage is a limit; it's a limiter, but it also is a holding environment. It's a kind of physical space that has boundaries, and strangely enough, if things go well enough, one can discover the deeper possibilities of love within limits. We'd think it would be the opposite. Well, love needs no limits, but there's just a paradox here. And there's something just vulnerable about being human that containers matter. And we know this as a child. I mean, just think about the wild innocence of an infant or of a 2-year-old. It's like completely dependent human beings on community and environment and physical space and boundaries and protection and a healthy spirituality actually honors a container. And I have to be honest that I think this is true, but for a good part of my own deeper season of wandering, I thought the problem was having any container at all. Like if I could just deconstruct, dismantle, eliminate all containers, I'd be free. And it turns out that's more like a prison. And so a certain diminishment is needed here. Yep, okay, containers matter. For Merton, it was the monastery, no doubt. In fact, he wrote under obedience, which is a common theme. He didn't want to write the 7-Story Mountain, for example, and his superior said, "Well, I'm telling you to." And you find this with Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross and about 7 other saints, that they don't want to write about their own experiences with God. But the container, the monastery, the order, the structure, there's some good to that, and it's not all about you. So there's a kind of consent here. So that was true for Merton. For Jung, it was kind of his marriage and his tower. That's what the author says. Here, I don't want to get into a whole Jungian thing, but In other words, a container is a good enough place to experience some mothering and fathering in the archetypal sense, a place to be held, and a place to keep others out. There's something about the boundary. Okay, this is the sort of thing I'm into, and those are the sorts of things I'm not into. That's important, even if you think you're non-dual or so forth, so forth. And of course, a container pushes against this resistant part in us that wants to be free of all boundaries, which can lead us in a way just to worshiping our own egos. So here's a quote from the book. Boundaries are imperative to force us to face ourselves. Wow, okay, know thyself. Come back to Antony, know thyself. Well, how? Well, we need some boundaries. That's partly what forces us to face ourselves. And even when I was in analysis, that's a container. It's a holding environment. And it was a fiery one, and it forced me to face things I didn't want to face about myself. So boundaries are imperative to force us to face ourselves, to turn our energy and attention inward, like Antony is suggesting, so that even our projections can be seen and worked with. So the way in which we're likely to see problems in everyone else, we're likely to see gifts in everyone else but ourselves, both of those things, those kinds of projections onto our partners and friends and figures on our social media feed and so forth. You need boundaries, you need a container, you need an environment in order to take some of those projections back, to see them really for what they are and begin to work with them. So we need a container. You can ask yourself, do I even have a container? What is my container? This is why, to a certain extent, I'm still a big fan of church. I'll come back to it from a community point of view, but just the structure itself of the boundaries of Christianity, the boundaries of thought, the images and the symbols, it's a container. And it holds us somewhere. It holds our feet to the fire. And I suppose we have some autonomy. Some containers work for us and others don't. But that's not really the point. I'm going to find the perfect container. That's actually not the point at all. Zen Buddhism, the monastery, even the world of depth psychology or Jung's marriage and his tower, they're not perfect holding environments. All religions have their problems, but they hold us somewhere specific. So you need a container. You can ask yourself, do I have one? Okay. Second foundation is we need a teacher. And, this is not so much in the book, but what I hear in teachers, something more like a mentor than teacher. Like in the Odyssey where Telemachus goes down to the water and meets Mentor. That's his name, and says, I'll go with you for a while to search for your father and find out what's true. And I'll help you grow up. And mentors come in those transitional phases. I was reading an article by a Cree about a Cree elder named John Cryer. And if I can remember, I'll put the link in my bio, and not in my bio, in whatever podcast description here. And anyway, it's an article about the human development model or map, they wouldn't call it that, inside the Cree stories, and it contains 4 mountains: the baby mountain, the warrior mountain, the hunter mountain, the elder mountain, and the elder mountain is something like the mentor, and the elder will visit these transitional phases between mountains, like say moving from baby to warrior to hunter. And I won't describe all because it's not my tradition. You can read it for yourself, it's absolutely stunningly beautiful map and image of human growth and development. But we need elders, teachers, mentors, or like rabbis. That's what Jesus was considered to be. It's not you didn't go to seminary back then. It's not a role like that. It's an archetypal constellation that you can inhabit, that courses through you. And here's a quality of the mentor that I think is particularly important. This is from the book. He says, this kind of teacher or mentor is someone smart enough in every sense of the word to see through the games we play with ourselves as well as with others. Maybe you've had a mentor or a teacher that really saw through your games. Yes, I have. I mean, and you do get pierced, and it does hurt from time to time. You realize, oh, this person isn't my friend. This person isn't here to support my illusions and my games and my persona and my ego and my tastes and my proclivities, to use old-fashioned language, my sins, No, they're not on the side of my narcissistic cul-de-sac nihilistic ego. They see through my games. My analyst was like this. When I was in the soul apprenticeship and initiation program at Animas Valley Institute for 7 years, my teachers and mentors saw through my games. Yeah. Okay. Someone who is not dazzled by our wit, intellect, beauty, or social standing. Now that's a real teacher. And they're few and far between, we have to admit. But I think it's important to ask, okay, we need a container. For me, I haven't been able to shake the wild Galilean and my own Christian heritage. I've tried. So I've got a container, and it's a pretty wildly mystical, deep, rich container. Okay? And I have some teachers. Some of them are still alive and some of them are dead. Jung has been a real teacher for me. Merton has been a real teacher for me. Richard Rohr has been a real teacher for me. I've only met one of those three. And of course, my teachers like Bill Plotkin and a few others at Animas. And my spiritual director has been a teacher for me. A real mentor, seeing through my shit, my games, my intellect. I had a therapist once, it just happened to me twice in my life, where it worked for a while until they wanted to work with me on something. Like, I kind of like where you're coming from, and like maybe we should do something together. And boom, all the wind goes out of the sails. And in a way, and this is a bit unfair, but it seemed like maybe they were a bit dazzled by whatever, my perspective, and they're no longer a teacher or mentor. It's just, no, doesn't mean that that's wrong. Okay, we can work together, but the relationship is now different. So yeah, do you have a teacher? And maybe this is going to be a bridge to the next dimension here, but a good teacher shapes practice. And that's mostly what we're learning from our teachers. It's not like sayings or teachings, like memorize these things, memorize the things that I said, mostly it's a way of being that you're being mentored by, and you're being shaped by, a mode of being. Or it's like, I don't mean to sound too woo-woo, but it's like being in the energy field of someone, because that's a real thing. Their energetic quality, their way of being, their mode of being is what's most shaping. And a lot of that, historically, comes with practice. This is how I do things. Like the disciples say to Jesus, teach us how to pray. Or walk all the way to the desert to see Antony and ask him a question. You're like, teach me some practice here. And so, yeah, the teacher sees underneath our evasiveness and our games, but also gives us a practice. And today, I think, we probably need both psychological and spiritual mentors. And maybe sometimes those are the same thing, psychological and spiritual, but we need guides in both respects. We need teachers in both respects. Okay, so practice. The third foundation. So we need a container. We need a teacher. We need a practice. And any kind of practice that helps cultivate our awareness and deepens our connection with soul and God, that's the way I would put it, is the right kind of thing. And the thing with any practice is that it narrows our priorities. Like, I bump into this every morning. I try to have a regular practice, a morning practice, and every single day I can feel it bumping into and narrowing my priorities, because it's easier to scroll on my phone. And sometimes I do. Oh, it's time for me to pray. It's time for me to read. It's time for me to listen. I started listening to this app that my wife told me about 7 years ago. I'm like a late bloomer, called Pray As You Go. And it's the lectionary. It's very beautiful. Check it out if you want. But, it's more fun to scroll. It's more mindless. Or I'll get up on my high horse, so to speak, and say, well, I'm going to write this morning. I try to write every morning, but sometimes I'll usurp any form of practice just to write, And that's what practice does. It begins to narrow, it begins to winnow, it begins to poke at questions like, what is essential? What is really essential here? And of course, the traditional modes of practice that have come down to us in the great traditions, we could say: prayer, meditation, study, ritual, ceremony, caring for the body. What's the right way of putting it? A code of ethics, like the Sermon on the Mount is kind of like it's a narrowing code of ethics that's meant to challenge and shapes. It's a practice. In other words, if we're religious, seeking ultimate meaning, trying to orient our lives to what ultimately matters, that's my definition of a religious life, we need a practice, because we're just freaking human beings, and we're much more likely to take the easiest path, the path of least resistance, the path where we're not shaped and challenged, and a regular practice shakes us out of that. It orients our lives to something larger. And whenever we, let's say, meditate or pray, it's like we're also joining our ancestors and our future beings and ancient beings, when we pray in a certain way, and when we meditate, and when we study, and it helps broaden our context. Okay, so that's the third foundation. The fourth one is community. And if I'm honest, the community has always made me a little bit uncomfortable. I'm right on the edge in terms of extroversion, introversion, but I am more on the extroverted side. And so you'd think I'd be all about community, but I don't know, there were maybe something about growing up in a fishbowl, in a kind of like a big church, mega church kind of world, where just people peering in felt invasive. And so that's always made me uncomfortable, like even, early on, and as I started to take my own faith more seriously, and I was thinking about in my 20s and 30s, all these small groups were starting, and I was like, I just didn't really like it, if I'm honest. And, maybe there were reasons, there are probably some good reasons for that, but I'm just expressing my own resistance. In other words, I'm in the great divorce, more like the people who end up in hell that would just rather isolate, Well, I'll just move further from town. We don't have to, deal with people. Okay, but so let me just say some things about community, because there's something kind of paradoxical, particularly from a Jungian point of view, because part of maturing, continuing on the process of growth here, requires what Jung would call individuation, which I don't know, sometimes we confuse with individualism. It's not the same thing, but an individuated person does come up out of the mass mind. That's really a Jungian idea, and that's one of the first steps in maturing. In fact, early adolescent consciousness that's concerned mostly about peer group, sex, and society. That's a Plotkin phrase. That's the center of gravity. What group am I in? Who am I sleeping with? Where's my social status? That sort of thing. That's very much mass mind. That's group think. That's where ideology and politics tends to hang out. Group think. And now in our very fragmented world, it's like the groups are like endless that you can, hunker down in and create a little bunker and protect yourself. And this is our group and the way we identify, and as opposed to everybody else. And individuation does look like coming up out of that mass mind and stepping into more autonomy, we could say. But here's the caveat, it doesn't stop there. It's almost like we come up out of the mass mind only then to rejoin the community. That's what a great rite of passage was supposed to help with. Like in Black Elk Speaks, when they send out Black Elk to do the lament, the vision fast, and he does have a vision. He comes back and tells it to the elders, and they enact it. They put it on almost like a play. In the community, it's like, no, coming into a sense of vision of your own that's gifted to you from God, from the Spirit, like in Black Elk, a vision for who you are in the world has to be integrated. It's kind of a fancy contemporary word. I can't think of a better one at the moment, but you have to rejoin the community at a certain point, because we're all relational beings, period. There's no such thing as an individual. Not even on the biological level. We have bacteria in our body that are alive that aren't, quote, us. Like we are, and we couldn't live without them. We're relational to our core, every breath, every cell, completely, wildly interconnected and interdependent. And so there's something beautiful that about growing up, that, we step more into autonomy, step more into, this is my way of seeing the world and being in the world. Here are my gifts, my deeper gifts, but they need a community in which to be grounded. And I don't know if you caught that from the 7 stages of a life transformed from my Christ symbol, but near the beginning, you have a couple of important stages. That's what I was claiming, or phases that Jesus passes through. Yes, he has encounter, divine encounter. Something about who he is on a deeper core is revealed by God. He has a wilderness experience, a real challenging examination and wrestling match with the demons here, internal. That's the wilderness wandering. There's a fasting and an emptying, and he comes up out of those experiences with gifts, a sense of who he is, and rejoins the community. He makes disciples. He sleeps in people's homes. He eats meals with people. It's concrete community. And here's a line from the book: no one heals in isolation. So there's that's like so profound to me. And you can ask yourself, well, what's my relationship with community? Because community does 2 things. It challenges and encourages, and it's just easier to not have one, if I'm honest. This reminds me, I sort of mentioned at the beginning, the book, The Holy Longing, Ronald Rolheiser's book, great book. He says there are 4 non-negotiables to the Christian spiritual life. He says private prayer and private morality, which is kind of like practice, but private prayer, social justice, traditionally called almsgiving, but caring for the weak and the marginalized concretely. He says mellowness of heart, which is a mode of consciousness. Like, that's interesting, a non-negotiable mellowness of heart, so less reactive. And the 4th harmonizes here. He says community as true worship. He says not only do we need community, like what I've just been saying, but he says it's actually puts us in line with true worship. We can't do it alone. There's only one body and one Christ made up of many members. The hand cannot say to the foot, I don't need you. The eye cannot say to the mouth, quit talking. The ears cannot say to the belly, I don't need you. Just spinning off Paul's image here. But actually, when we come into worship, I'll use a line from T.S. Eliot, when we learn to kneel where prayer has been valid, that's communal. There's a communal expression to that. That doesn't take away from our wild individuality, the uniqueness of our own spiritual life, the way we might pray. But it's community that keeps us connected to something larger. We need a container, a holding environment. We need a teacher or two. We need a practice. And we need, unfortunately, we could say, or fortunately, we need community. After all, we're not just social beings, we're not just a social animal, but it is the way the world is. If everything is interconnected and interrelated and in a state of dependent co-arising, if God is speaking the world into existence as if it's the first day of creation, as if the whole world is coming into being now, it's the very nature of its essence is this wild web, a wild web of connection and beauty and meaning. And hell is endless autobiography, is the opposite, is isolation, disconnection, sealed off walls, loneliness, and self-absorption. Yeah, free us from this, we might cry. And so, I don't know, I maybe just to come back to some of my opening things here, I think there's something about our spiritual culture right now that really loves autobiography. And maybe we just need to hear, be warned, don't get stuck here. And there's something powerful that the tradition and traditions are offering us here. Ways to not get stuck. Find a container, find a teacher, find a practice, find a community. Be honest if you don't have these things. And ask for them, long for them, look for them. Make yourself available to them. Maybe they're right in front of you. Maybe they're as close as heaven and hell in C.S. Lewis's allegory. They're as far apart as as a blade of grass, one side to the other. And so maybe they're right in front of us and we just don't have eyes to see quite yet. So that's as far as I want to go today. Maybe I'll end with a quote from Merton. I don't know if I said it, but welcome to Hints and Guesses, my podcast. Kent here. Thanks for supporting me. Special thanks to my patrons. Please join me on patreon.com/Kent Dobson. And join me. I got a bunch of Animist programs coming up. Look on their website. And I have a program here in Michigan, June 12th through 15. Would love to see you in person. My annual Wilderness Within retreat that I've been, my friend Adam Thompson has helped me with this program the last few years. So we're going to guide together again. Would love to see you there. It's on my website. Send me an email. Okay, got that in. Okay, so let's end with some paradoxical lines from Merton. For me, to be a saint means to be myself. I love this. For me, to be a saint means to be myself. Yeah, know thyself. Relax. Come back to your senses. Shed your personas and your self-absorption and obsession. That's all sainthood is. All any of us are being asked is ultimately to be what we were created to be ourselves. But then he's got a little twist here. In an age where there is much talk about, quote, being yourself, I reserve to myself the right to forget about being myself. Since in any case, there is very little chance of my being anybody else. So I hope you can hear the lightness and depth here of what Merton is trying to say. Like, all right, a lot of people are talking about knowing themselves and being themselves, and he's just saying, I reserve to myself the right to forget about being myself. Yeah, there's a certain relaxation that's needed, a loosening of that grip, to forget ourselves on purpose, he says elsewhere. So I hope you hear a hint, a guess, a clue, something that will carry you just a little bit out beyond the borders of your own cul-de-sac. Peace.